Go ahead and open your Bibles to the book of Joshua. Be in chapter 1 to begin. The book of Ruth. And I promise that at 10 till tonight I will have actually gotten to Ruth. Unlike last week when it came to 10 till and we were talking about Jericho and we hadn't even got to walking around the city yet. We'll try to do a little bit better this evening than I did then. You know, Ruth is the name of the book. But I would say that Ruth is not the main character. I think most people might argue about that, but Ruth does not seem to be the main character. It seems to be Naomi. Naomi is mentioned more than Ruth, whether by name or in inference to her. And, you know, the book literally begins with Naomi and ends with Naomi. And so Ruth plays a very large role in that, but it is about the recovery in the life of Naomi. Ruth takes place during the days of the judges. By all accounts, we are looking at a very dark time in the nation of Israel. The nation is rebellious. The nation is evil in many ways. And even in the book of Judges, you have a hard time finding heroes that don't have some serious dark sides to them. Think about Samson. As much as we look at Samson and we see him as one of those great heroes, Samson had some real issues, didn't he? Some real spiritual issues that the Bible is very plain about. I mean, if you just take the Nazirite vow that he had and how many times he violates the Nazirite vow that he was under. You know, even men like Gideon, which we'll talk about next week, had some paganism in their life. And so this time was not a good time. It is a time when we look at a land that is so evil that toward the end of the book of Judges, there are roaming bands of people looking to sexually rape people, just like we saw in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. If you remember the concubine that was raped and killed, and they cut her into 12 pieces and sent her throughout the land, and almost resulted in the total destruction of the tribe of Benjamin. That's the kind of world that's in place right now in the book of Judges. And the reason for that is that everybody was doing what? What was right in his own eyes. Let me tell you what, folks. When man does what's right in his own eyes, things are a mess. And all you got to do is look at the book of Judges. And we're going to talk a little bit later that there's another phrase that may be misunderstood, but goes right in line with right in his own eyes as we look at it throughout the book of Judges. You know, the book of Ruth is about being in need and having those needs met, however those needs may be met. You know, this takes place in a time when they have a hard time finding, as I mentioned, any kind of spiritual leadership. It's not really going to be until Samuel that we really seem to have someone that shows the integrity that we really think needs to be in place over the nation, and they don't want him either because of that very thing. You know, I heard a thing, you know, that there's a lot of hungry people in our world. And if you've traveled outside of the United States and even in industrialized countries, but especially to continents such as Africa and some third world countries, your eyes are open to that a little bit more. There's a Bible study being done where I was working in Africa and the stomachs of the children were bloated because they were so hungry. And you have to be careful in that environment because if you give out money or you give out things, it creates the wrong motivations in people. But how could you study if a person has to have food? How could you study with a hungry person? And that's what we see here. The book of Ruth is about people that are hungry and people that care. And, you know, and I'm not just talking hunger as far as a physical aspect. Well, Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 2 says, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed, and that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of the wife Naomi, and the names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. I already messed that one up. You know, once you mess it up, you can't hardly get it right. Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. So according to this text, why did Elimelech go to... There we go. Why did Elimelech go to Moab? Famine. They're hungry, aren't they? And yes, when we look in the book of Judges, we see throughout the Old Testament that sometimes famines were what? Not so natural. Sometimes famines was God, right? Making the people turn back to Him. And sometimes they were natural. We really don't have any indication as to which is the case in this particular instance. But what's interesting is that they live in the city of Bethlehem, and the name Bethlehem means house of bread, and yet this story begins, and the house of bread has no bread. There's no food. And so Elimelech is taking his family somewhere else. This is a time of great need. Well, let's look at who the Moabites, that's where they went, to the land of Moab, and it's over there where the circle is, so they'd have basically taken that route to get around to there. The Moabites were descendants of Lot and his daughter. In Genesis chapter 19, verses 36 through 38. You remember Lot and his 2 daughters, they fled from the destruction of the cities in the valley, and it seems that they thought that they might be the last people left on earth. They looked down and they saw the destruction in the valley, and so the daughters decide to get their father drunk. And both daughters become pregnant by Lot. And the one daughter had the Moabites as her descendants. Well, the land of Moab was located on the east side of the Dead Sea, as you can see on the map there. Sihon, king of the Amorites, took much of the Moabite land right before the Israelites arrived in 1406 BC. We see that in Numbers chapter 21 and verse 26. Now the Israelites would go on to defeat the Amorites and King Sihon and come upon the land of the Moabites. But they were forbidden by God to harass or provoke the Moabites in any way as they passed by their land going north there toward the area of Jericho. And God forbade them from doing that in Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 9 because He said, I have promised this land to Lot and his descendants. Now this probably goes back to Genesis chapter 13, right? Where Abraham and Lot are standing there and they realize that where they're at, their flocks can't both be supported in the land that they're at. And so Abraham gives Lot that choice, right? And he chooses that area. Because in Numbers 25 it speaks of how the sons of Israel played harlot with the daughters of Moab and began to worship their idols. And in one day, 24,000 Israelites were killed dead for their immorality. In fact, that day is so engraved in the Bible that Paul's going to mention it again in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, isn't he? As an example of do not be immoral. Because folks, we need to understand that God is not kinder and gentler in the New Testament. God hasn't changed one bit. And as angry and as upset and as you know, even when we see what He does there on that day, He's still the same God. He may not operate that same way, but it still bothers Him the same way. And that should scare us just a little bit. 24,000 were killed. Most of those seem to have been in the tribe of Simeon, and we know that because of the census. Simeon is the only tribe that lost people from the first census. And if you add that up, they would have been more in line with where they should be. You know, this advice by Balaam cost him his life. When the Israelites attacked the Midianites, they found Balaam And they killed him in Numbers chapter 31 and verse 8. Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 3 tells us that God cursed the Moabites and told the Israelites that a Moabite was not allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord. A Moabite could not enter the assembly of people, could not be a part of the decision-making process in Israel, could not be a leader at all. Now, he says, if you read that text, it will say to the 10th generation. But let me tell you, when God says 10th generation, He means forever. Because then He turns around and says they're never to be. Not just a generational counting thing, but that they are never to be a part of that. They were not to have the privileges of the people. Why? Well, God tells us why. He says because the Moabites were not hospitable. Do we think hospitality is a big deal? When God curses this people because He says when the Israelites went by, they didn't come out and offer any help, any water, bring anything. They weren't hospitable. Even though the Israelites absolutely did nothing to threaten them by God's command. But they were an inhospitable people. And God said they could never be a part. And He also told Israel that they were never to seek peace with Moab. And they were to never allow Moab or be a part of Moab prospering in any way. During the time of Judges when Ruth lived, Moab had oppressed the Israelites for 18 years as a punishment from God. And that was only turned back by the judge Ehud there in Judges chapter 3 and verses 12 through 30, the left-handed knife man, if you know that story. Elimelech takes his family to that land. He takes them to Moab. And I don't know if this was a good idea. I mean, there's food there, right? So, I mean, from a physical standpoint, a physical need standpoint, I guess it's a good idea. But I don't know how good a deal that is for you spiritually. I don't know how good an idea it is for you, from a standpoint of how you're going to fit in with your own people again someday. They're the enemy. They've oppressed the land. It seems like it had to be an odd choice for Elimelech to make, to go to this particular people. And maybe that was just where the food was, where the famine had not reached for whatever reason. I've known some people at times that have made decisions to move, but when they've made their decisions to move, they never looked before they moved at, are there any churches there? Are there any congregations that we can attend? They get there and they realize the only congregation is 60 miles away. Shouldn't we probably think about that before we put ourselves in a position where we have a very difficult time being with God's people? And, they're going to have a difficult time, at least from the standpoint of their day in and day out life. I'm sure they came back at times for the tabernacle and for different events that God called for feast days and things of that nature. But this is an odd decision for him to go here. Elimelech's name seems to show that he was a man of faith. His name meant, "My God is King." That's a good name. And I told you a while ago, there's a message in that name, I think, from the book of Judges, from another statement that's made in the book of Judges about their unfaithfulness during this time. 4 times in the book of Judges it states that there was no king in Israel. And I think, and I know that when I was younger, I thought a lot about, when I read that phrase, I just went on past it going, yeah, you're right, there's no king in the time of Judges. They didn't have a king until 1 Samuel, right? When Saul became king. But that's not what they're talking about. It's not just a statement made because there wasn't a king like King Saul or King David or King Solomon. It's not saying that there. I think that's our first glance thought, but I think it's something else. Twice, when it is said 4 times, but twice in 17:6 and 21 and 25, the phrase is paired with the statement that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It says, in the land there was no king at this time, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The statements appear to be connected, don't they? Because see, what is being said when Judges says that is that God wasn't king in their lives. They had a king, they just didn't want him. And so when you get to these times and they're unfaithful, there's no king in the land because they're not serving the king. They're not submitting to the rule of the king. That's the same as doing what is right in their own eyes. You know, God was to be their king. Listen to what God says. I find this a sad statement. It's just when God says it, it's kind of one of those statements that you're sad for God. And it should wake us up to how our stubbornness and our sin is hurtful to God. But in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 7, this is when they're demanding a king. We want a king like the nations around us. We want to be like everybody else. We still have those same kind of calls in the church, right? We want to be like the religious world around us. And it's just as dumb a call today as it was then. But listen to what God says. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me." Listen to the rest of it. "From being king over them." They had a king, but they rejected him. They turned him away. God said, "I wanted to be their king, but they rejected me." Let them have their Sauls and their Solomons and their Ahabs and whoever else down there that we could list going into the future. Their Rehoboams and Jeroboams. You know, Elimelech's name is symbolic of what God was supposed to be. God is my king. I would that even if we weren't named that legally, I would that we were named that in our hearts. Verses 3 through 5. Elimelech dies in Moab. We don't get far in this story and things go really bad, don't they? Really quick. I mean, it's bad enough to start the story in a famine that you're going to have to leave your homeland to go find food, but it goes from bad to worse really quick. Her two sons take Moabite wives. Naomi's two sons do, Orpah and Ruth. And after living in Moab for 10 years, Naomi's sons die, leaving her alone with her two daughter-in-laws. In verses 6 through 13, it says, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited His people in giving them food." In other words, there's now food in the house of food, right? There's bread in the house of bread back in Bethlehem. The famine is gone. So she departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So Naomi wants to go back home. She's going back home to Bethlehem, and she calls on the Lord to deal kindly with these two young ladies. She states that they were good daughter-in-laws, and they were good wives. That's what she means by both to her and to the dead, to their husbands. These were good women, good ladies, and she commends them to God in that way. She asked the Lord to give them husbands so that they can be at ease in the homes of their new husbands. And they wept. I mean, it's clear, and I know we know this from Ruth. I'm not giving anything away here. These women were close. They loved each other. There was a tight relationship, a tight bond here. Verse 10 says, "And they said to her, 'No, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Return, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight, and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you. For the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. So these two wonderful young girls, they asked to go to Judah with this woman that they love like a mother. And Naomi asked them, why? Why do you want to do this? She has no sons, even in her womb, for the girls to marry when they're grown, when the sons are grown. She is too old to have a husband, and the prospects of having children for her are slim to none. Then she asked of these young women, even if she could have a husband that very night, and become pregnant with sons for them, would they want to wait around until those sons were grown to marry them? Would they want to wait that kind of time frame? And you understand, don't you, that what we're talking about is probably waiting through a time frame that would take them through the main years, primary years of childbirth and childbearing. So literally missing that prime in their lives, which was so important in that day and time. And so, that's what she asked them. And what this discussion is about, I know this sounds weird to us, talking about having children for you to marry someday later to a daughter-in-law. But what we're talking about here is what was called levirate marriage, where a brother would marry the childless widow of his brother. And their first child would legally be the brother's child, not the man who fathered the child. And he would receive the brother's inheritance and keep that line going. In Israel, this played an extremely important role, and we even see that here at the end of the book. But it played an extremely important role in the dispersion of the land to the people, right? Each family was given certain places in the land that was theirs. And that continued to pass down through families, and so it was important to have those sons that could then be the heirs of those lands. And so that becomes an extremely important aspect of this particular society. The law for the Israelites in this regard for levirate marriages in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. Genesis chapter 38, though, we see it even back then, long before the law of Moses. We see it with Judah, right? Now Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, Judah had sons named and Onan. And a woman named Tamar married Now, when you look at those 12 sons of Jacob, those were pretty bad fellas, okay? Exception of Joseph. But the brothers were pretty rowdy. And yet this son was so evil that the Lord killed him. Was killed by the Lord because of his evil act. And I want you to listen to what Judah says to Onan. He says in verse 8 of Genesis 38, Go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law and raise up offspring for your brother. Now that's the law. That's what we're talking about right there. Onan understands something. He's done the math in his head, and he understands that if his brother has a son, if he goes into Tamar and she has a son, then that's less inheritance he gets, because then that's going to go to the son, inheritance. And so he refuses to allow her to get pregnant, and God strikes him dead. God was kind of serious about this. And so Judah then, as we know the story, he had another son named Shelah. He was very young, and so he told her, let him get a little bit older. But yet when he got a little bit older, Judah was afraid to give her to him. I mean, God struck 2 sons dead that married her. You know, he's afraid to give this son to her. We know the story. She plays the harlot and has children by Judah. And those children, were twins, and they fought in the very womb of her. Perez being the one that would be a part of the lineage of Jesus. And so we see that levirate marriage there. And we see it as well in the New Testament, do we not? In the Sadducees' test. Wasn't that what they were talking about too? The woman married a man. He died. Married his brother. He died. Married his brother. He died. Right? So there it was again. So this is that levirate marriage that's going on. That's really what the very core of Ruth is dealing in. So Naomi has no sons to make this happen, to provide sons for her dead sons and their inheritances. She says, no, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. You know, Naomi's path forward was much harder than these 2 girls' path. And Naomi understood this. She knew this. For a woman in the Bible times, your retirement plan was children. There was no Social Security. Children were the retirement plan for women. And Naomi has no children. She has no grandsons. She has no husband. She has nothing and no legal standing to be able to have anything. You know, we look in the New Testament, the widow of Nain, and that is a story with the same lesson as Ruth, isn't it? Here comes a widow out of a city in the funeral procession of her only son. She has no one now, right? Only son, husband's dead, she's alone. Has no way to go forward, with the exception of God. And Jesus walks up and he raises her son. It's very similar in this idea. You know, here is Naomi. She's a widow. She's lost her sons. How will she survive? She needs a son. She is hungry for happiness as she looks for family. And she's hungry physically as she looks for food. Her path is a difficult one. The girls are still young. They'll be able to find husbands and bear children and take care of that, and those men will take care of them going forward. But there's a hopelessness in Naomi. She seems to think that the Lord's hand is against her. It's not an uncommon thought process in the Bible, is it, when things go bad? Certainly, you know, we look at Job, but there is a little truth in it. And God even acknowledges that. That nothing happens in this creation that God does not allow. Nothing happens against His allowance. And we see Him make a statement on that line in Job chapter 2 and verse 3 when He talks about Job. And He says, and he still holds fast His integrity. But listen to what God then says. Although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. Now we understand the devil did it, right? But God allowed it. And God takes that. He says, I've allowed this to happen. You caused me to allow this to happen. And yet He's still faithful. So God there is addressing His allowance of it. It doesn't make God guilty of it. But He does allow certain things to take place in a world of choice. We need to understand that. And she feels this way as well. You know, in Naomi, like Job, though, in Naomi's most difficult time, the end of her story is not yet written. I think that's what we need to always remember. Folks, you're going to go through hard times. We're going to go through times when we cannot see the other side of it, when we cannot see how it's going to get any better. And we need to remember that at that moment, the end of our story is not written yet. And we might not be able to see it, we might not know it, but if we trust in God, and that story, no matter what, ends in a good place. But Naomi's going to have more than she had before, just as Job had more than he had before. And as bad as it is at this moment, she just doesn't know all that God is willing to do for her. And that's the same for us if we just have faith in what God can and will do. In verses 14 through 22, we're spending more time in chapter 1 because the rest is going to kind of fill out what's being set up in chapter 1. These verses are well known in verses 14 through 22 and often used in weddings, and we're not going to spend a lot of time here. Orpah, she wept with Naomi, but then she kissed her and she returned to her people. And let's not be down on Orpah. Orpah, I can't believe she went back home. She did exactly what her mother-in-law asked her to do. She went home. No reason to look down upon her. There's nothing negative in what she did. I don't think we need to hold Ruth's exceptionalism against Orpah. Orpah obviously loved her. She wept with her, and then she went back home. And Naomi tells Ruth, "You go with your sister-in-law. You follow her. Do what she just did. Follow her example and go home. Be with your people." And that's where Ruth gives that great speech to Naomi, right? I've known people that have stood up and taught a Bible class and said that's Ruth saying that to Boaz. No, it's not. She's saying it to Naomi. Wherever you go, I'll go. Your God's my God, and where you're buried, that's where I'm going to be buried. Not in my home on my home plot, but with you. And what she is talking about, it's a statement of complete devotion. It is a lesson for the time of the judges where people did not commit to God in this way. And yet Ruth shows the level of commitment that God deserves. Everything of Ruth in life and even death belonged to Naomi. That whole life devotion, it is the devotion that God deserves and demands. For Ruth, these are not hollow words. They are from a heart of conviction and devotion, and it's obvious to Naomi. Because it tells us that after Ruth says that she will not leave, Naomi never says anything again about her leaving. She got the point, didn't she? She arrives in Bethlehem, and she's literally the talk of the town, Naomi that is. And she tells people in Bethlehem, I want you to listen to where Naomi's mind is right now. People are coming up and going, "Hey Naomi, it's good to see you again. It's been 10 years plus. I don't know how long it was before, but it's been a while. It's good to see you back." Naomi says to them, she says, "Don't call me Naomi." Her name means pleasant. I assume she lived up to that. I don't know. But Naomi said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," which means bitterness. She said, "I'm bitter because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." Her loss and her hopelessness has caused her to become bitter in this way, maybe unpleasant being the opposite of her name. And I wonder if some people thought that she got what she deserved. Well, you went over there to those Moabites. Should have stayed here in your homeland with your people. Don't you just think that some people talk like that? That's just how people are. People haven't changed. Naomi and Ruth arrive at the time of the harvest. Naomi leaves, and there is no food when she leaves, and she comes back, and there's an abundance of it. It's the harvest time. So such a difference. Chapter 1 shows Naomi lose everything. Chapters 2 through 4 is Naomi getting it all back, like Job. In chapter 2, we see that Ruth went out to glean in the field of a family member of Naomi's dead husband. His name was Boaz. And Ruth is gathering food, but also hoping to impress a man who might want to be her husband. When we think about this idea of gleaning, I don't know how much an idea we have, or how much we understand what's going on here. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 through 10, God gives a commandment in regard to the harvest. And God commanded the people to not harvest the corners of their fields, and anything that they dropped on the ground while gathering, you had to leave on the ground. So if you were, I'm sure they were saying, don't carry too many. You don't want you dropping a whole bunch. But whatever was dropped on the ground, then that was to be left on the ground by God's command, so that the needy and the stranger or the foreigner can partake of that which has been left or dropped. Well, while she is out there picking up this that has been dropped, gleaning that off of the ground, she catches Boaz's eye, and he inquires about her and finds out more than the text initially shares. Boaz was a good and godly man. He greeted his reapers every day with the statement, "May the Lord be with you," in verse 4. He is also a man who appreciates and rewards the good deeds of others. He tells Ruth that, and this is why I say that he's told more than we have in the text. He says, "I know what you've done for Naomi. I know you've been there for her. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you being that kind of person." And so he wants to help her. Boaz tells Ruth to only glean in his fields. He provides her with water and food from his table. He tells his reapers, don't bother her. Don't insult her. You got to wonder how many people were out there trying to glean and probably got a little bit on the nerves of the reapers who were, out there trying to work. And I'm sure that, it appears that maybe they insulted them to some degree. He said, you don't insult her. You leave her alone. And then he goes even so far as to say, listen, guys, when you're putting those sheaves together, just drop a few. Let's do a little on-purpose leaving on the ground for her to come and pick up. I mean, Boaz is looking out for her. Ruth gleaned all day and left the fields of Boaz. You ready for this? With 29 pounds of grain. That is a month's worth of food. That's half the wages for the reapers for a month. And so she goes out there, and in one day she gets 29 pounds. She provides the food for her and Naomi through the graciousness and goodness of Boaz. She provides their food for the next month. Well, when Ruth gets to the house and she tells Naomi about Boaz, Naomi begins to make a plan. Because Naomi sees something here, right? Naomi goes, yeah, he likes you. I mean, that's what's going on here. Naomi goes, yeah, I see that. I got this. And so she tells Ruth, you don't go to any other fields. You just go to Boaz's. And she even puts a little scare tactic on it. She says, because if you go to some other field, some man might jump you out there. You just stay in Boaz's, okay? So she's even trying to scare her to stay in the right fields. I mean, Naomi is looking out for Ruth. She's even going to tell her, she says, it's my job to make sure your future's secure. And this is where she begins it. Because at this point now, time passes. And it says that Ruth is living with Naomi, but she's gleaning in the fields, and she's there through the barley harvest, and then she's there through the wheat harvest. So now we've jumped forward in time to the end of the wheat harvest in chapter 3, and Naomi tells Ruth that she has a plan that will find her security. Ruth is going to propose marriage to Boaz. Bold woman proposal here. But they have to do it carefully. Because what do you have? We have a Moabite woman, and you have an upstanding citizen in the city of Bethlehem. And proposing marriage to him is not something you need to do in downtown Bethlehem. That's not going to work so well. So we got to do this kind of quietly. Kind of outside the prying eyes of everyone in Bethlehem. So Naomi tells Ruth to bathe herself, to put on her best clothes, and get this, ladies, perfume yourself up. Okay? Even back then. Perfume. So she put on her perfume. Boaz is at the threshing floor. This is basically what a threshing floor is, kind of a simplistic, small scale. They put all the stalks that they pulled out of the fields, they put them there in the middle, and then they would slowly spread that out, and that horse goes around with that sled on it, and it dislodges with little flint teeth the grains from the stalks, and then they throw those away, and then they begin to winnow out the chaff and other things. But that's what's going on. That's where Boaz is at when she tells her to go there. It says that he's sleeping there at night. Well, that's common. When you have been out harvesting your fields, the last thing you're going to do is leave it out overnight so somebody can come and steal it, right? So you sleep with it. And he's sleeping up against what is the pile in which that has been harvested out there in that field. And Ruth comes there and she does something very unusual and sounds kind of weird. She uncovers his feet. But really, it is simpler than you think. If my feet come out the end of the covers, they get what? They get cold, don't they? And what do we end up doing? Well, we reach down there and get our feet back in there, whatever we got to do to cover back up our feet. That's exactly what's happening here. He's asleep there. She comes, she uncovers his feet, and in time he wakes up, and the Bible uses a word for twisted. He twists. And that, you get this idea of reaching down to try to get your blanket. And he sees there's someone laying at his feet. And it's Ruth. But it's very dark. She can't really see him. And this uncovering of the feet is a way that they proposed marriage. And so he cannot tell who it is. He asks who it is. She tells him. And she tells him who she is and then asks him to be the kinsman redeemer. Now your translation translations have different things, but verse 9 there, it might say close relative, but the translation is kinsman redeemer. The person who's kin that can redeem someone in a house. She asked him to be that, the one who could redeem her in marriage and children. And really it's about redeeming Naomi, who Boaz clearly respects and cares for, and he is called the not Ruth's kinsman redeemer, but the kinsman redeemer. Ruth says, I want you to cover me. And that means cover me in your protection. We talked about Sunday night about Jesus and his, "O Jerusalem, how I would have gathered you under my wings like a mother hen gathers." That's the idea that's going on when she makes this statement. He tells her that he is not the closest possible redeemer. Well, that's the worst news she could have heard, right? I'm not the next one in line, sorry. But he says that if that man will redeem her, good. If not, he will. And he tells her to remain until morning. He's probably worried about her. There's, going out, we already talked about in the book of Judges, there's a lot of bad characters out there doing bad things at night. And so he wants her to stay there and be protected, and she remains at his feet. And she got up to leave just before sunrise, and Boaz gave her some wheat because he said, "I do not want you to return to your mother-in-law empty-handed." Boaz commanded that no one know that the woman came to the threshing floor. Folks, never make a mistake here. Nothing immoral happened in this situation. Both are honorable in character and in their descriptions in the book, and nothing is implied in this text that would say anything other than they did that which was moral and right. Naomi immediately wanted to know how it had gone. You ever wonder if Naomi stayed up all night waiting for her to come home? It's like a parent waiting for a kid to come home from a date, right? She sent her out there, and now she's been waiting for her. She wants her to tell her how it's going on. She told her she knew Boaz. She said, he's not going to procrastinate. We'll know soon. He's going to head straight out there and take care of this. I can promise you that. And that brings us to chapter 4, where Boaz goes to the seats by the city gate. And those are actually the seats at the city gate of the city of Dan that had been uncovered, where the men of the city would come. And when you came there, you might come there and the judges might be sitting there, the elders might be sitting there, prophets would sit there and tell the people what they needed to hear. Business was done there, agreements were made there, and that's where he goes. And he is waiting, and that other kinsman redeemer of the family soon came by, and Boaz told him that Naomi was selling some land that belonged to Elimelech, and would he redeem the land, keep it in the family? In other words, will you take the land? Keep it in the family. He goes, oh yeah, hey, get some more land, right? Boaz doesn't give him the whole story, does he? He kind of, he's tricky. he's a sly fella. He goes, well, I forgot to tell you this part. With the land, you got to also take Ruth. Oh, I can't do that. He said that would mess up his inheritance. I don't know if that's the truth. or if that was some kind of dodge. And so he said, I can't redeem her. I can't do that. Normally, when a redeemer refused to do, what God, remember Judah said, your responsibility is how he worded it. Then the woman would come and spit in his face to dishonor him. Well, that's not going to happen here. Because this is exactly what they wanted anyway. They want him to turn it down. They didn't want him to take it, so they're just fine and dandy not to disgrace him in any way because they're getting exactly what they want. Maybe, and I got to thinking maybe Boaz's willingness to marry, maybe he didn't want to marry this foreign woman, but maybe Boaz has a different perspective and I want to tell you why I think Boaz might have a different perspective. Who knows who Boaz's mother was? Anybody? Talked about her last week. Rahab. Boaz kind of has a different perspective on foreign women, doesn't he? Jericho Rahab. Maybe that was why he didn't have any problem. Well, the elders quickly claimed that they were witnesses to what happens. We know the rest of the story. I don't want to spend a lot of time because I'm running out of time. I always do. But they said that he would now marry, he'd marry Ruth, and that would raise an heir for Mahlon, but it would also raise an heir. It would redeem as well Naomi and Elimelech's inheritance. Everyone seems very pleased with the arrangement. Then the text tells us that they marry and they have a son. Verse 14 says, "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today." This is what is said to Naomi. "And may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better than 7 sons has given birth to him." How about that praise from the Jewish women? Ruth's better than 7 sons, but she gave you a son that's going to take care of you in your old age. That's what redeeming's about. Verse 16, they put the child on Naomi's lap. We began the book with no food, no husband, no sons. Now she has more than she ever had before because of Ruth. I want to give you 3 quick things to remember on this. By the way, she's holding the future in her hands, is she not? King David's coming through that lineage. 3 things to remember from this lesson. Help people while you're hurting. Don't ever forget that Ruth lost her husband. She's hurting too. And yes, she worked for Naomi. She worked to take care of her. There's nothing better for you when you're hurting than to help others and to work for others. Work while you wait. God's timetable is not yours, and maybe it's going to take a while for Him to give you what you ask, but go ahead and get to work on it. And let God bless you in His time. And then remember that when you think you are all alone, you never really are. Because God is always there. And there's good people. There are Boazes out there. There's Ruths out there that love and care and want to do everything they can to help. So don't ever think you're alone. Let's end our class with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we've had to study your word, and we pray that we will place it into our minds and into our hearts and live it in our lives, Father. Pray that you go with us from this place and that you protect us and guide us. Pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.